Yeah. Yeah, I think you tell me. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this, but there's something about being in ministry that feels or can feel, maybe I shouldn't say it feels, but it can feel very constricting, like you're in a bubble. Like your whole life becomes the sermon on Sunday, coffee hour, the picnic for that year, the finances for the like it becomes this like small thing, and then you don't really get to like experience world outside of that bubble. So yeah, I don't know. Have you experienced that, or is that just me?
Welcome back to the Christ and Coffee podcast. We are back from our summer break and we're bringing to you today our 120th episode. Our mission is still the same. We want to unite Christians one conversation at a time, and we're doing that by bringing back the OG co-host of this podcast, the Reverend Jeremy Tovmassian. Jeremy and I started this podcast at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, and we've been having Christ-centered conversations ever since. Today, we're going to talk about what he's been up to since he's left the podcast and how he's become a full-time family and marriage therapist. He still does ministry part-time, and we learn about the differences between being a pastor, being a therapist. We learn about how to find a good therapist. We learn about how to cultivate our active listening skills. What are the pros of doing ministry when you're not a professional minister? We have so many nuggets of wisdom to find in this conversation. But before we begin, I would like to share with you the verse of the week, which comes from Proverbs chapter 11, verse 14, where there is no guidance, a people falls, but in an abundance of counselors, there is safety. But before we jump into today's conversation, if you could do us a favor, follow us as we drink coffee and follow Christ together. Follow us on Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. Follow us on Instagram. Every bit of following helps us promote these Christ-centered conversations. And with that said, please grab a cup of coffee and enjoy this program. Welcome back to the Christ and Coffee podcast, my friend. Welcome back. How's it
Thanks,
going?
man. It's good to be back.
It's kind of been quite the trip. We started this thing right in the middle of the pandemic. I had my online Christ and Coffee videos, and then we're like, let's just have a podcast like everyone else. And it's been quite the journey. And I do want to just publicly bury our hatchet between us. You know, we've had this crazy beef that led to you stop being on the podcast. All right. What was the beef about?
Yeah, man, I don't know. What was the beef about?
Was it just
What?
we were growing apart?
I can't even imagine beef that you and I would have. Like, it's so silly. Like, we're such easygoing people.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just funny. It's just like, yeah, there's nothing. It's just we kind of were pursuing ministry, starting young families, and other things. So there's just for the record, there's no beef between
No hate here.
nothing but love. And
We started this thing in a pandemic when we had a lot of time on our hands. And
yeah,
then as the pandemic eased up, it was like, oh man, there's a lot of other things out there we have to tend to.
yeah.
I also moved, you moved, like we both had like big life-changing things.
We also had kids. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. So it's not, there's no love lost here.
not at all. And also for the record, so you pivoted from full time ministry to now doing part time ministry, and now you're a professional therapist.
Yeah, so I'm actually time is a flat circle, so I'm like in the exact same spot I was when we started this pandemic podcast back in 2020. But I'm back in Chicago, so I was working full time as a marriage and family therapist in Fresno for a little over, I think over 3 years. Got licensed in California, worked there for several years, and then I got a job offer back out here in Chicago. So I'm working full time at a practice there. I maintain some of my California clients here since I'm licensed still in California, and then I work part time for the Armenian Evangelical Church here in Mount Prospect in Chicago.
That's great. So full circle, 3 years after kind of doing the podcast and then moving out west, and now back
Yep.
the Midwest.
Yep.
And what were well, first question before we jump into what life is like with the experience of being a family therapist and also a pastor.
Yep.
What was this is a very important question. How do you drink your coffee? This is the question. This is the
How
new
do I drink
question
my
I asked
coffee?
the guests.
I'm boring. I'm an addict. It's plain black coffee, like without any cream, without any sugar. Right now I'm drinking a Metropolis blend from the Chicago area. Typically French press it. That's my go-to French press
That's
coffee. What do you
that's.
drink?
I'm a black drinker as well. I normally drink espressos in the morning. I have one of those machines and just get an espresso shot to just stay like just to wake up pretty much.
Hmm.
It's not even like a pleasure. It's more like my morning medicine.
Yeah.
And then my drink of choice is actually a really nice iced pour over black coffee. Sometimes you're not supposed to like water down the pour overs, but when you do a good ratio and you drink it quick enough, it's actually really nice. I like it a lot, especially out here where it's hotter. Um, so
Yeah,
yeah, it's
what I found out here is I had never seen this before, but they do cold foam with iced coffees or with cold brews. It's actually really good. Have you ever tried that?
I'm not a big fan of a cold brew. I feel like it's too acidity for whatever reason.
Oh,
I like
interesting.
I'm
Okay.
not a. It's
Weird.
weird. I'm not a big fan of cold brew, and I hate it when I go to coffee shops and I ask for a nice coffee, and they automatically assume cold brew, and I have to always like make sure they're not giving me a cold brew. And half the time it's like, oh, here's our cold brew. I'm like, I don't want that.
I don't want that.
I'll
Yeah,
just have
yeah,
a
yeah,
hot coffee instead.
yeah.
So yeah, I've become more of a nitpicker over time, especially as this podcast has evolved. I've become more of a coffee
The
connoisseur.
coffee snob. Yeah.
Yeah, like Starbucks doesn't do it for me anymore. Like I
No.
get like an acid reflux and
Yeah.
I have like a downward spiral. Like I'm getting to that level of snobbery.
I'd love for you to get the Starbucks advertisements and promotions here, but
Oh,
yeah,
then I would love Starbucks all
I
of a
haven't.
sudden.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I
yeah,
haven't been a
Starbucks is
big
the
fan either. Although some of the Starbucks now have this thing called what's it called? The name escapes me, but it's like an instant, like you press a button and it's a hot pour over coffee like instantly. I can't remember what the name of it is. Uh, but they have these machines that do it. Like the grinds are up top. They hit a button, it boils the water, it grinds the grinds, and like right there for you is a fresh pour over coffee. That's pretty impressive.
is it Starbucks?
Yeah, yeah. I can't
Cool,
remember the name of the machine, but they're starting to introduce them into certain like markets. It's pretty interesting.
very cool. Yeah, I'll take a look into that. I'm not sure what that is, but there's always these cool inventions, and I think kind of like there's a move now from like to have baristas in the home now. It's kind of like the
Yeah,
technology is getting there, and people are appreciating the need for it.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah, it does save money if you do it home versus at the coffee shop. It does add up. I mean, inflation's been insane, and the coffee went from like $3 to like $7 at this point. It's kind of wild what's been happening.
Yeah, it's insane, man. I mean,
Do you feel like the inflation and the financial struggle among young people is something you see in your practice a lot?
yeah, yeah, definitely. I also work a lot with couples, so it's one of the like major concerns in any sort of relationship is the home finances and like how you know stick to a budget, and there's stuff that you just can't like budget for anymore because the cost of things like shifts and changes so quickly and rapidly. Interest rates are insane too, so anybody in a credit card debt situation or anybody in a like auto financing or out to buy a home, like it feels like really impossible for people now. So yeah, I see it in the practice. It's a source of frustration for young people and a source of conflict for people in marriages and
Yeah.
relationships.
No, it seems like it's something we don't talk about for whatever reason. Is it something that's talked about in like church circles? Not really. I guess therapy circles, maybe.
It's talked about in some therapy circles. We do consultation with our group of therapists where I'm at out here in Chicago, and it comes up there. But we don't talk about it very much in church settings, I guess, do we?
I don't think so. I think it's like one of the things you don't. It's a shameful maybe to talk about, but I think it's such a important part because it kind of reflects. It's like it's one of the more objective things to analyze, But there's never an objective thing with money. It's always an emotional thing or a shame thing, or.
Yeah.
Uh, but it's fascinating because I do think it's been interesting because I feel like every young person I'm talking to is really struggling, and then a lot of the older people are like, the market's doing great, I'm doing great, and it's just like a two. It's like a two world. We're living in two worlds, kind of.
Yeah. Yeah. The equity is kind of imbalanced there. If you have, assets, you're good. If you don't have assets and you're like working, it's a little bit tougher. It
Yeah,
seems like.
yeah.
Yeah.
Any
I don't know about like, yeah, back to the church thing. I'm not sure what it is that makes it so difficult for people in church settings to talk about money.
Yeah, and did you find um and people always get weird when pastors bring it up because of the negative. Like everyone jumps to
Yeah.
like every pastor being this like televangelist, prosperity gospel person or something. There's the stigmas there.
Well, yeah, most pastors, at least that I've grown up with, when they talk about money, they're talking about giving money.
Yeah.
So like, but there's so much more about money that and like people's financial position that there is to discuss and explore. Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure why we don't do it more.
And you were saying that it's usually one of the main uh issues of conflict among couples, right? Just
It's one of
finances.
them. Yeah, yeah. It's uh, yeah. There's a handful of like, yeah. The joke is that most couples therapists will say that like when you do an intake, the first thing somebody says when they come into couples therapy is they're there to work on communication.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's like it's a joke. It's like almost every intake. That's exactly what like somebody will say. We're here if we can just communicate better, then I think that we'll be fine. Um, but yeah, when you get into the details under the hood, like there's topics that are charged with conflict. One of them is finances. Some of it has to do with upbringing and family of origin and stuff like that. There's all sorts of ways it could be hashed out, but yeah, no, I mean, finances is a big one. Yeah.
What are some other ones like in-laws?
What are some other ones? A common one is just like the imbalance of responsibilities in a relationship, so roles that partners play with each other, and um, there's a great quote from a couples therapist. She's like a relationship and sex therapist. Her name is Esther Perel, um, and she has a line in a book. She says, uh, "In the modern West, uh, couples or individuals will experience two or three different marriages, sometimes to the same person." And I love that quote because I really think our experience of like marriage in the modern world has dramatically changed from what it used to be, like even 100 years ago. So like there's so many more opportunities for individuals in a relationship to like grow and learn something new about themselves or become a different person, and different moments in the life cycle, like people just kind of shift and change and realize things about themselves that they want to explore further. So that's a really big one I've noticed more recently, is people like just kind of pivoting and saying, I don't want to play that role in our marriage anymore. And so like what does our partnership look like if I'm not that person? And like is there space in a relationship to adapt and be flexible to, okay, like you don't want to play that role. Let's see what a new partnership, what a new marriage looks like on the other side.
And you mean like just redefining people's roles here? Not like like kind of like finding a new partner, but just all right, we're in a new season. We're gonna take these responsibilities and whatnot. Yeah, and I think the typical gender norms are kind of not as clear as they used to be as part of it, right? Um,
Yeah, I mean, yeah, a big one is a switch in who's working, right? Like, uh, a mom going to work full time and a dad staying home, or different different kinds of jobs, higher paced jobs. One partner usually plays the role of, being the breadwinner, and the other one takes the job of choice that brings them passion. But then what happens if that switches, and then the dynamics in a marriage change then, and it's like, how do we build a new relationship from those dynamics?
Do you, this is like from my personal observation, but do you find that if the guy is not like carrying his weight and the wife is carrying the weight, it's just like a recipe for disaster down the line? I mean, there's always exceptions, but I find that if the couple is like in the kind of the same industry and the wife is doing better than the guy, I find that I've seen those couples divorce or break up.
Yeah, I
I've
mean, it
noticed
can
that.
happen. I mean, most of those, I think there's a lot of potential for a way through that, but I think some men, I think, have been so kind of put in the grid of understanding masculinity in one certain lane that to have that lane challenged, I think, is really hard and difficult. And so sometimes it becomes untenable. They just can't make it work.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's
It's,
it's it's wild too, but I like that because I think the different phases of just being married to dating to having kids at a certain age, all that affects. It's constantly changing. You're constantly changing and evolving. But the beautiful thing about a marriage is like we're going to be committed, even though we're going to change, positive, negative, rich,
yeah, and
poor, healthy,
I notice,
sick.
yeah, in evangelical circles, I see it a lot because at least when we were younger, in our sort of like in our cohort, I think people got married a lot younger in evangelical circles, like
The ring by spring thing. Yeah.
21, 22, 23. Like there's all sorts of reasons that that kind of thing happened, like socially, contextually, culturally. But yeah, I mean, you think about who you were at 21 and who you are at 40,
Yeah. A different person.
totally different person. So if your marriage was founded on the idea that we were going to have that same identity at 21 throughout, then it's a real rock, to the marriage. Yeah, it becomes difficult.
So let's talk about your journey because I don't quite know the moment when you were like, I'm going to become a therapist. What was that like? What led you to that decision?
There's a couple of things. So one, I was working full time at the church, and I was kind of exploring, uh, like how I could use some of the things that I saw as strengths, like ministry strengths that I had here in the church. How could I sort of accent and like hone those skills a little bit better and use them just personally for my family to build some financial security and things like that. And so uh, I was looking at different options. There's a great friend of mine, Reverend Vache Ekmekcan. I think we might have had him on the podcast a while ago, did we?
I don't think we have him, but
Yeah,
he's
it
a great
was.
guy.
Okay, maybe he wasn't.
Maybe I should get him on the podcast. Yeah.
Um, but he was going through a program for marriage and family therapy. I'd never heard of it. So I just called him and connected with him one day. And actually, he stayed in Chicago for one of his residencies for like a week to do trainings. And he stayed with us. He lived in our house for a week. And actually, shout out to Vache. He cooked some really great meals for us too. He's a like 5-star chef himself. But he was telling me a little bit about it, and it piqued my curiosity. So I ended up sort of like taking a big jump and taking a risk and applying for a program, and started with one class. Really enjoyed it, really loved it, and then I went fully into it. So I was working and full time, and I was at nights going to school doing the marriage and family therapy gig. And little by little, it really spoke to me. And um, as I was practicing and training and doing clinical work, I was getting a lot of observations and compliments about how what I had done well in ministry transferred really well into therapy. And so I found it really fulfilling, and it got me outside of the church. I think that was something I was getting a little bit disappointed in, is sometimes ministry can feel like a bubble, like you're
Right.
in this
No,
bubble. And
I
it
hear
was
you.
very like, uh, it broadened a bit of my horizon. It allowed me to be out there in other relationships and other contexts where I felt like I was still doing ministry, just without the sort of nomenclature of a pastor or something.
Right, right. Because a huge part of what pastors do is counseling. What would you say is the strengths and weaknesses of pastoral counseling versus just the professional therapist interaction? Like, what would you say are the key differences?
Oh, that's a tough question. Uh, yeah, I mean, one big difference is just the amount of training you get in seminary. Like how much training did you get actually? I'm curious. I only got like a semester.
I got like, I think I had to take like 3 classes, but they were also like under the pastoral care sort of like umbrella, which included like preaching and doing the sacraments and stuff like that. So it wasn't necessarily a big, there was like a couple of psychology classes I remember taking. And I didn't learn much about them in the psychology class, but I think the best kind of training I got was when I was a chaplain at Bellevue. So the CPE program, I
Yeah.
had a good director. He always talked about listening to the music behind the words.
Yeah.
um, that was really helpful because that was like a pressure cooker. I went in thinking I was a good listener, and I left realizing I suck at listening. So like, yeah. I think that was really helpful. But besides that, I didn't really learn much.
Yeah.
I was. I think one of the things going into pastoral ministry is like I was just completely oblivious to mental health issues in general. Forget about people just seeking counseling, but what does it mean when someone walks through your church with a severe mental health issue that they don't want to tell you what it is, and how do you manage that? Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
and so I think being thrown into the job forced me to learn more about mental health. But seminary didn't do a good job of equipping me in the sense.
Yeah.
Um,
And there's something about that too that's kind of cool. Like your recognition of what you needed came from actual experience in the field.
yeah,
And like, I feel like that would be a great way to frame how pastors get training and like get support in counseling and ministry. Like to have like continuing education kind of programs for pastors to understand some of those concepts, because that's the real life stuff that you're going to see in ministry often. Um, the main difference, I think, I'd say between like pastoral counseling and clinical like mental health therapy is the focus. Like um, the pastor's focus, I don't think, is to sit and deal with the long haul of mental health issues with individuals. It's to find them help, to get access to help. And so I kind of think of pastoral counseling as a sort of like triage, like ER situation. Like, let me get this person well enough to be able to seek help out from a clinician that they can get long-standing care from. It's also like very draining work.
yeah. No, it takes a whole day. I don't think people realize how draining listening to someone is.
Yeah, there's all sorts of boundaries that get blurred too in pastoral ministry and counseling settings, and there's confidentiality issues, and it can become very tricky and very complex. And so I typically tell friends of mine who are pastors, if this is something that isn't like if you're sitting with somebody counseling a congregant, if it's something that you can't kind of work through with them for 4 or 5 meetings, then refer them out to a trained professional.
So I find that finding the right trained professional is always a hard part for me because there's like not all pastors are created equal, not all
Yeah.
therapists are created equal. How do you
Yeah.
know that you're sending, like, how do you find a good therapist is the question, I guess, whether you're a pastor trying to kind of give a reference or you yourself don't, or just know you're in trouble, you need to go find a therapist. Like, what are some tools to find a therapist?
Oh man, it's so hard. I gotta say, like, I don't have a perfect answer for this question because it's the mental health world, like it's it's a behemoth. It's really hard to find somebody that you like trust and that you can build rapport with. And my best suggestion for pastors is to build a relationship with somebody in your community who's in the mental health profession, and through that relationship, get referrals. Um, so if I have a congregant, or if I have even a client who I want to refer to somebody for couples therapy or individual therapy, because we don't, if I'm doing couples therapy with somebody, I don't see them individually. If I do a referral, I'm always going to want to double check with, another clinician, somebody I trust, and get a sense of like who they know in the field, who they know in the community. So to pastors, I would just say, like, have a relationship with somebody in a clinical counseling background. And, as you build trust and rapport with them, find referrals through that program.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And then what about if you're like not a pastor and you're just looking online? What are some, like, especially as a Christian, I want my Christian friends to find a Christian counselor. Not
Yeah.
all Christian counselors are created equal either.
Yeah.
So it's like, how do you find that? Because my frustration with some therapy out there is like there's no foundational truth to kind of be spoken. It's more about just this analyzing the problem but not uprooting the core when it comes to some counseling problems. I'm not talking about like specific mental health diagnoses. I'm talking about just finding the help that's needed to uproot the root of depression or anxiety or something like that. Like, how do you find a good Christian counselor? Is that just like a filter you use? Is it like Christian dating where you have to kind of like discern how Christian they are? like
It's so I'll say this, any any initial contact with a therapist on a consult call or anything like that, should be open game for you to ask any questions that you want early on. And if they are defensive about those questions,
the
then
therapist?
move on. The therapist. Yeah.
Okay, so if the therapist is being defensive, okay.
Yeah. If you call a mental health professional and say, I'm looking for somebody who works in, Christian counseling, I'm looking for somebody who's willing to work with me through spirituality issues or concerns around my faith. If they are like dodging questions, or if you feel like they're being defensive as you ask those questions, move on. The therapist is supposed to work from your space of meaning, from your like tradition, from your perspective and your world. And so if on that first call you don't feel comfortable with them, like, just, next. there's
Right.
a there's directories out there, like there's all sorts of there's Psychology Today, there's Therapy Den. There's a website called Open Path that allows for like low fee therapy. So when people have a difficulty paying for therapy services, they offer like low rates for people to get access to mental health care on Open Path. If you find somebody that you feel like fits, they usually have little bios and things like that they put together to speak to the clients and to sort of market themselves. Then do a consult call and talk with them and be very upfront and honest with them and transparent in the beginning. And if you feel some sort of resistance or defensiveness, that's on the therapist. They're trained. They're trained to be able to handle whatever you bring. So if
Yeah.
they can't handle that, then I wouldn't be making a second call.
No, I mean even in pastoral ministry, I think one of the main things to do when people are like confessing or sharing stuff is this ability to suspend judgment, withhold it, and just kind of show grace by just being able to listen without
Yeah.
putting
Yeah.
yourself into it. And I
Yeah.
feel like some people do that a lot actually when this is just for everyone, right? Like everyone
Yeah.
trying to help a
Yeah.
friend.
Yeah.
It's like, are you listening to the person or are you trying to just like project, oh, this is how I would do it? It's like kind of like Job's friends. You're trying to play detective and you know the
Right.
right answers, but while your friend is like literally in pain and it has nothing to do on their own, it's just they're
Yeah. Yeah. There was a like a tradition of psychotherapy. So like just like in the church world, there's different sort of denominations and things like that, and different traditions. There's different traditions in psychotherapy, and there was a tradition. It was called collaborative therapy, and one of the postures they used to. I loved it. It was in the in the textbook. It was literally like the collaborative therapist takes a posture of not knowing. So they like talk to the client and they're like, I don't know anything about you.
yeah.
So like even if you feel like you do know a person, to take the posture of like curiosity and not knowing, it yields a lot more uh, connection, and it also brings out a lot more from the individual about like what is actually going on behind the scenes from their lived experience. So I guess like I found therapy as a way to accent what I experienced in the church, and it allowed me to do ministry in other areas that I wasn't really being able to do ministry in the church. And I think it felt kind of liberating. It felt freeing.
Yeah.
Like full circle back to the beginning of that question. It's like it was it was kind of a new terrain for me to explore my ministry skills in. So, and I feel like that's kind of where like a lot of pastoral ministry is going, in those directions where pastors are finding new ways to do ministry. And sometimes that means kind of like bivocational or alternative ways of conceiving of ministry. Have you found that in your experience of ministry, has the role of pastor sort of changed and shifted?
Yeah, I mean, like with the podcast, with some teaching gigs here and there, I kind of like view the pastoral role more as like some focus more on the counseling pastoral end, some like to teach and preach, some like to kind of be like a nonprofit, like local leader of sorts to kind of push the envelope. I find myself gearing more towards like opportunities to teach more, or preach more, or like so I've kind of gravitated towards like the social media world, right? What we're doing right now, or just doing a 1 minute video, or being a guest lecturer at some school. So stuff like that have kind of supplemented the role, because I think the small local church pastor can't be surviving as a small local church pastor anymore, like you said, and then we have to kind of pivot. And I've seen other friends just leave ministry altogether because of that, not because they don't feel called anymore, or not because they're not a Christian anymore, but because of out of like necessity. And it has opened the doors to kind of reach people you wouldn't normally reach as well. And I think yeah, I mean, like, isn't it weird when you left being a full-time pastor, like the people questioning, like they were assuming worst case, like you left your faith or something?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah, I had a lot of that. It was
isn't that
funny.
insane?
What
Like,
happened? You forsook your faith. It's like, I don't, like, have you had a conversation with me? Like, you don't know anything
it's like,
about me. Like, what? So there, a healthy dose of not knowing would have been, a posture of not knowing would have gone a long way. But yeah, yeah, I think, you tell me. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this, but there's something about being in ministry that feels, or can feel, maybe I shouldn't say feels, but it can feel very constricting, like you're in a bubble. Like your whole life becomes the sermon on Sunday, coffee hour, the picnic for that year, the finances for like, it becomes this like small thing, and then you don't really get to like experience a world outside of that bubble. So yeah, I don't know. Have you experienced that, or is that just me?
no, totally. Yeah, for me, who has like a heart to talk to non-Christians, like I kind of enjoy talking to non-Christians a lot. Like, and the moment I became an ordained minister, like 10 years ago, I realized a complete drop in that. And then especially when you have family and kids, you just don't, you can't have time to talk to people who come from a different background. I actually really enjoy talking to people who don't believe in Christianity, just to kind of, I'm curious to learn more about them.
Yeah.
So I definitely noticed that the moment I became a full-time pastor, I think I became less evangelical in that, like talking to non-Christians about Christianity. But I find ways around it. I think it was easier when I was single in New York, because you could just go out and talk to people, and that was always a lot of fun. But now that I'm like a suburban guy in California, it's hard, because I was thinking about this past week actually. The schedule of a pastor is inverted for the typical person. Our weekends and weeknights are full of work, normally, and the weekday where everyone else is kind of working is off. So it's like we really our schedules are out of sync with the rest of society because of the job.
Yeah.
And it's also a job where you bring your family to work, which I was also thinking about this past week.
Yeah,
like what other job you're like your kids
and they're
have to show
expected
up
to work too.
yeah. So there's a lot of like weirdness to this role, and I get it. You're supposed to be more than just a job, and it is more than a job. It's a calling. You're supposed to be a community leader. You're supposed to bring people together. The pandemic taught me that church work is more about just creating community. I used to say all the time, church is not coffee hour. Now I'm saying no, coffee hour is a huge part of church. We have a podcast. I have a podcast called the Christ and Coffee Podcast, for crying
Yeah,
out
yeah,
loud. And the
yeah,
whole point of what we're doing is just having real, organic conversations to kind of, learn from people's perspectives, bring the church together from the different theological lenses, different worldviews. And like, it's the whole point of this podcast in a nutshell, is to be able
yeah.
to learn from people, trying to suspend judgment. Even though I have strong opinions, mm, you know,
It's funny, yeah, and I think, yeah, yeah, and I don't know, the being able to break out of that bubble and being able to like interact with people outside of that like smaller church community. I think I it, I don't know, maybe you've experienced with this with the podcast or even just like in ministry experiences elsewhere, but either being bivocational or having like something else outside of the church, it's like an excuse for you to like reframe or like rebalance. And like that church is important. Like the church is, God is at work in the church and we need to tend to these people. And it's also not the only place God is, like it's not like the center of the universe. Like, there's other things going on in the world and it sort of just gives you like a bit to breathe. Like, okay, coffee hour is going to be fine. The picnic's going to work out. Like these things are not like earth shattering. And I think it really just creates space for you to do ministry from a more grounded like grounded place. Like,
yeah, or a place that relates to like the people in the pews, and then
and
empowering
that,
them
yeah,
to
yeah,
to
that's
do
right.
that.
Yeah.
I think that's our main job as pastors, is just to empower people to be Christians in their workforce and in their families and whatnot, and just to
Yeah.
kind of be that light in a very dysfunctional world. But yeah, if we're not doing that, yeah, it's tough, especially after you've been doing it for a while. You find yourself in that kind of world and not thinking what the your foot is not really on the ground; it's more on the job.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
how do you apply your Christian values and faith into the therapy world? Like, what are some Bible verses, or what are some principles of Jesus that really help you be a good therapist? Talking about
Yeah.
bringing your faith into your workspace.
Yeah. That's a great question. I don't know that I'd have any specific Bible verses, but I think the posture of like genuine care and compassion for people who are hurting is a like profoundly Christian
Yeah,
posture. Like it's the posture Jesus takes in most of his ministry. And the idea of, I think of like in I think at least two of the four gospels. I don't know if Mark has this scene, but Jesus looks out at the people and he sees them like sheep without a shepherd, and it says he's like deeply moved to compassion. That feeling of like gut wrenching like care for others, I think is like built into what it takes to be a good therapist, and so. Um, Yeah, like I think that that's a genuinely Christian intuition to like want to be in care of others and to be supportive of others in their journey of finding health and wellness is like really important. Um, and I also think, I mean, at least uh, in my experience of church, there's a lot of church that feels like politics, and like having a background in being able to help people collaborate, like having a background in like civics and like solving problems is a part of church life. And I found that like working together and making things work is really helpful in a context of like therapy as well, especially couples therapy. Um, and I think that's part of a lot of what St. Paul is doing in most of his letters to the churches, is trying to help people in a diverse community find some sort of unity and harmony as the body of Christ. So yeah, I'd say those are pretty like big themes that inform how I think about what therapy is.
so just to stress my active listening skills, if I did a good job. So there's
You're gonna
one piece.
flex a little bit. Yeah.
There's one piece here where the individual person just moving to with empathy being the kind of the foundational piece. I want this person's health. I care for this person. My heart's breaking
Yeah.
that this person's breaking. That empathy piece, like Jesus has compassion on the crowd. So that there's that individualistic motive piece as you, and then there's the corporate reality of the world, like you said, like people have a negative connotation to conflict or politics, but that's the reality of life, whether it's in the big local community of the church or the marriage couple. Conflict resolution is a huge part of what St. Paul was doing in all those letters. There was a reason
Yeah,
why he was writing those letters. He was trying to do conflict resolution to keep the unity of the
right.
body of Christ, to connect it to Christ and to each other. And that kind of sums up a lot of the commands. It's just like connect to God, connect to each other. We need to figure out conflict resolution. But if it's not moving from the place of empathy, that you're in trouble.
Yeah, if it's not an empathy, if it's not based on human wellness and thriving, then it's almost, yeah, it's like real politic. It's like
Yeah, yeah.
it's
Then it's my
super
self
brute.
interest, right?
Yeah, it's kind of
Yeah.
brute, and it's a little bit more cynical. But what's interesting that I found is that sentiment of Jesus, like they're when he's moved to compassion because they're like sheep without a shepherd, and I find that there's a profound loneliness to all of us in the way that like culture and society has been arranged. Like there's like a yearning for direction, or like a yearning for something that like organizes and like pieces together the parts of our lives. And so there is a lot of just aimlessness to like to life. And so in the way that we've constructed culture right now. So it feels like when I'm sitting with people too, it's like I get to connect with them on the feeling of like, wow, this is like, it feels like being sheep without a shepherd right now. And like, let me give you what I know. Let's try to figure this out together. So there's a collaboration even happening there
Well,
in
yeah.
ministry.
So you talked about just the loneliness of the society. I mean, there's a lot of data talk backing this up. There's that book Bowling Alone, and it seems like there's just a complete disconnect. Less people are plugged into just not they're not plugged into community. They're plugged in on their phones. Is there like common mental health things from your the data or just your observations of like what are some kind of like main things young people are struggling with, for example?
Yeah,
That
I mean, yeah, you talk about loneliness, disconnection, and a feeling like the world isn't getting better. Those are like at least three key traits for depression. You add in, two or three others, like not being able to wake up in the morning, overeating, things like this, or not eating. Like those are like clinical markers for, major depressive disorders. And so there's a huge uptick. If anyone's interested, there's a book that just came out recently by a psychologist named Jonathan Haidt. He wrote a book called The Anxious Generation. And the brief summary and thesis of his book is that something around the 2010s ticked off a huge increase in adolescent and teenage depression, self-harm, suicidality, and anxiety. And as he researches the impact of certain different like stressors, he comes to the conclusion that it's almost undeniably the introduction of social media, self-facing phones, and the disconnect people have as a result with human community. Everyone interacts with each other through a digital community. There's a sort of uh, entering into a digital space and exiting the real, whatever the real space is around us. And so that has been very impactful in a negative way on young people's mental health. So, um, I mean, I see that on a daily.
yeah,
I
no,
don't have a session with an individual under 30 who's not grappling with some sort of major depressive episode or anything. I mean, granted, that's skewed because I'm seeing
right,
people
right.
because they have problems, but
No,
but
but it's like a same common problem, and yeah, the
yeah,
roots may be different, but no, I mean, I mean, we're a big experiment with the whole first generation introduced to a new way of communicating, and how we communicate affects the way we think. And a large part of my research was that kind of how digital ministry or digital communications impacts not just how we do ministry, but it literally shapes the way we think. And if we're not
yeah,
plugged in literally to a local community with other people, we're in trouble. I mean, it's that's not, it doesn't take a rocket scientist. I think what that big experiment out of Harvard that was surveying the health of individuals over time, those
Yeah.
who had the most fulfilling life, I think the main thing they said is like they were just really connected with people. Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
oh,
Imagine
thank,
that.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So,
We're social animals.
yeah,
We always have been. We always will be. Like it's part of our makeup to flock and to herd together. And so to do that digitally just doesn't do it in the
no,
way
no.
that human contact and face to face communication and interaction does.
Yeah, and I stress this all the time with my when I talk about Jesus's ministry. It's all around the table. Like you're forced to engage when you're eating with someone. You share that in common. You're sharing the sacrifice before you.
Yeah.
Then he pivots it, and when he says the church, like, look, this is the meal to remind you of how I connect you to God and to each other, and you got to make sure your sins are forgiven. You got to make
Yeah.
sure your
Yeah.
confessions are up to date. You got to make sure
Yeah.
there's no beef
Yeah.
like there was between us, or
Yeah. Yeah.
you
Yeah.
got to
I'm
reconcile.
glad we cleared the air.
Yeah, yeah, clear
Yeah.
the air there. But yeah, I mean, it's really loving God, loving other people, and that's what a church should do. And then there's these things of mental health and sin and unforgiveness and all these stuff the scriptures really go after to kind of uh, go after for the sake of preserving your relationship with God and with each other. Like I feel like that's what's being missed. I remember going through Leviticus, and we did that episode on Leviticus way back, and like there's all these sacrifice rules, but the whole point of it was that these sins needed to be absolved so that relationship with God would be
Yeah.
upheld. So
Yeah.
like there's even in the Old Testament, there's this personal relational God, and it's like all these things to like, no, this stuff is bad because it affects our dynamic and your
Yeah.
dynamic with each other.
Yeah. Yeah.
It,
Yeah.
um,
Well, and I mean, I think one of the as you're saying that, one of the things that comes to mind is that like in interacting with each other in a digital space and in a digital platform removes a lot of the intangibles of like human contact and human conversation. One of them is accountability. If I say something to someone face to face that's really hurtful and harmful, I see it on their face. You go on Twitter and just post something really harmful and hateful about somebody. There's no visible, like, you don't see the visual stimulus of somebody hurt.
yeah,
There's a humanity to it that is lost. And so I think it's also contributed to a lot of the vitriol in our political discourse and just in our like polarizing from end to end, where it's like you can just, yeah, say whatever you want without any accountability for it. But those things have meaning, and despite the saying, words will break you sometimes.
yeah, no, definitely sticks and stones, but words, man, those
Yeah.
words.
Yeah.
Any final words? If you would have one message to share with the church in America, what would you share?
Yeah. Yeah. I think such a great way to end a podcast. What do you want the American church to know? I think I'd probably want it to know that God is doing things all around. God is bigger than just one manifestation of the church. It doesn't mean the church is insignificant. It means that God is calling you out to other things as well. And so I think just the boundaries that God has drawn are not, the four walls of the church. There's lots of things going on out there in which you can participate and in which God is doing and working. So I think whether that's like breaking outside of just like the American church context and seeing what God is doing in other cultures and countries, or whether that's on a local church level and thinking like the life of the church depends on, the annual fundraiser. Uh, yeah, God is doing bigger things than just that one manifestation of the church. And so join him. I think when I think about the book of Acts, what I love about the book of Acts is how uh, it's just this constant surprise of the church thinking, are we allowed to do that? Like, can we go over there? Like, are we allowed to cross that cultural boundary, that social boundary, that economic boundary, or whatever it is, that taboo, and actually do that thing? And God keeps saying, like, yeah, come over here, join what I'm doing there. There's this like outwards explosion that happens in Acts, and it's uncomfortable and weird, and there's all sorts of meetings that get held in Acts to sort of figure that out. But I think that that's part of the lesson for the church in the 21st century. Like, there's a lot of great stuff happening outside that church. Go join God in what he's doing out there.
Well said, brother. And that was a good answer to the question not too long ago. And it's good to see you back on the podcast. It's good to bury the hatchet and clear the beef publicly.
Yeah, I'm glad.
It's good to know that you're still a Christian. Like, all this stuff is amazing.
We can take communion now because we've hashed out our differences, and we can,
All right, brother. Good to see you. It's always a joy. Thank you, everyone, for watching to the end of the Christ and Coffee podcast. Stay caffeinated, my friends. We'll see you next Wednesday. God bless you, and take care.